once again. Guilty feet have got no rhythm. Though it's easy more that you leave me. I've heard the song, I know it's wrong.
He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the door. He didn't even look angry. He just stood there, quiet, still, like he was waiting for something in the air to change. And when the room finally went silent, he said it. Not a speech, not a threat, just a sentence that felt like a warning. A sentence that sounded like a man who already knew what the world does to artists who try to belong only to themselves. And George Michael didn't answer right away. Because in that moment, it wasn't about music. It was about something heavier, something most people never see. The invisible chains, the ones you don't feel until you try to walk away. If you care about the real stories behind the legends, the moments they never explain, subscribe to RetroWaves. Because what happened between George Michael and Prince was never framed as a feud. Not publicly, not officially. There were no headlines about arguments, no public insults, no dramatic confrontations for cameras, just distance, silence, and a kind of tension you could sense only if you looked closely, like two men standing on opposite sides of the same storm, both refusing to admit how loud the thunder really was. George Michael didn't talk much about Prince, not the way fans expected, not the way journalists wanted, and Prince almost never explained anything in plain language. He didn't owe anyone explanations. That was part of the point. But there was a strange truth underneath all of it. George admired him. He admired what Prince dared to do. Not the outfits, not the stage theatrics, not the mystery, the courage, the part where Prince looked at the industry and decided he wasn't going to play the role they wrote for him. Prince didn't just want to be famous, he wanted to own himself. And that's the part George couldn't stop thinking about, because George Michael was trapped in a different kind of cage, a quieter one, a prettier one, the kind of cage the world applauds. George wasn't just a singer, he was an image, a global voice, a perfect product, the kind of artist executives loved, because he could do it all. He could write, he could sing, he could sell, he could make the world fall in love with a melody and not even notice the strings attached. And for a while, George believed he could be smart enough to survive it. He believed he could be careful. He believed he could negotiate. But deep down, there was always that question. A question he didn't ask out loud. Not at first, not even to himself. What happens when the thing you created doesn't belong to you anymore? It's hard to explain to someone who isn't inside that world. Contracts don't feel like chains when you're signing them. They feel like doors. They feel like rescue. They feel like validation. They feel like the beginning. But later, much later, you realize the fine print isn't about money. It's about ownership, not just of the songs, of your time, your identity, your silence, your future. The industry doesn't just sell records, it sells pieces of you. And Prince understood that earlier than almost anyone. He saw the trap before the door closed. He felt it in the meetings, in the language they used, in the way they smiled when they said, "We believe in you." Prince didn't trust those smiles. George did, at least at first. George came up in a world where success meant you were safe, where chart positions felt like protection, where awards felt like freedom. But Prince came up believing success was just another leash. And if you weren't careful, you'd be dancing for someone else forever. George watched him from a distance. He watched Prince do things that felt impossible. He watched him refuse to be predictable, refuse to be controlled, refuse to be managed like a product. And there was something about it that unsettled George, not because he disliked it, but because he recognized it. He recognized the bravery, and he recognized the cost. Because rebellion isn't just a decision, it's a sacrifice. It means losing doors, losing allies, losing comfort, sometimes losing everything. And George Michael had spent years building something fragile, something huge, something the world wanted from him every day. Prince could burn bridges and build new ones out of fire. George was different. George carried his sensitivity like a secret bruise. He didn't just feel pressure, he absorbed it. He didn't just hear criticism, he lived inside it. And that's why this story matters. Because it wasn't just two icons, it was two philosophies, two survival instincts. Prince believed the only way to stay alive as an artist was to own your soul. George believed he could keep his soul without losing the world. And that belief is what broke him later. But not yet. Not in the beginning. In the beginning, George was still trying to make it work. Still trying to smile through interviews. Still trying to play the game without becoming the game. And every time he saw Prince push back harder, George felt something he didn't fully understand. A mix of admiration and fear. Because Prince wasn't just fighting for better deals, Prince was fighting for something spiritual, something personal, something almost sacred, the right to be unowned, the right to not belong to anyone but himself. And George Michael, quietly, privately, wanted that too. But he wasn't sure he could survive it. He wasn't sure he was built for it. He wasn't sure he could walk away from the machine without it swallowing him whole. There's a strange thing about artists like George. They don't just fear failure. They fear disappearance. They fear becoming irrelevant. They fear silence. Because silence isn't peaceful when you've been loud your whole life. Silence feels like death. And Prince? Prince didn't fear silence. He used it like a weapon. He used absence like power. He used mystery like armor. And George didn't know how to do that. George wanted to be loved, not in a shallow way, in a human way. He wanted to be understood. He wanted to be accepted. He wanted to give the world something beautiful and have the world hold it gently. But the industry doesn't hold gently. It squeezes, it extracts, it demands. And when you finally collapse, it asks why you weren't stronger. George started to sense that, not in one dramatic moment, not in one explosive fight, but in the slow accumulation of tiny humiliations, tiny dismissals, tiny reminders that he wasn't in control, that the people behind the glass windows didn't see him as a person. They saw him as a return on investment. And Prince saw that too. But Prince didn't swallow it. Prince spat it out. And that's why George couldn't stop thinking about him. Because Prince represented the version of freedom George wanted, but didn't know how to claim. And somewhere in the middle of all that, somewhere between admiration and fear, there was a moment, a private moment, a tense moment, a moment George would never fully describe publicly, a moment where two giants stood close enough to feel each other's gravity. And one of them said something that landed like a stone in George's chest. It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't cruel either. It was just honest. It was the kind of honesty that doesn't come with comfort. The kind of honesty that forces you to face your own limits. And George, for the first time, began to wonder if his fight wasn't with Sony, or the press, or the world, but with himself. Because maybe the real question wasn't whether the industry could own his music. Maybe the real question was whether George Michael could ever truly belong to himself. And that's when Prince said it again, quietly, almost like he didn't care who heard. A sentence about ownership. A sentence about the soul. A sentence George carried with him long after the room emptied. And the strangest part is, George didn't answer. Not because he disagreed, but because deep down, he already knew Prince was right. After that moment, George didn't suddenly change. There was no dramatic reinvention, no public statement, no new persona. He didn't walk out of a meeting and tear up contracts in the street. That wasn't George. What changed was quieter, more dangerous, because the thing Prince said didn't feel like advice. It felt like a diagnosis, like Prince had looked straight through him and named something George had been trying not to name. And once a truth is named, you can't unknow it. You can only pretend you never heard it. George tried to pretend. He went back to work. Back to studios that smelled like coffee and cables. Back to rooms full of people who called him brilliant, gifted, unstoppable. Back to schedules so packed he barely had time to feel his own exhaustion. And he did what he always did. He made something beautiful. But underneath the beauty was a tension he couldn't relax. Because now, every time someone said, "Your record," he wondered whose record it really was. Every time someone talked about release plans, marketing strategies, radio priorities, George heard something else behind the words. Ownership, control, permission. He began noticing things he'd never noticed before. How quickly people around him got nervous when he asked questions. How polite smiles tightened when he wanted to change a plan. How meetings suddenly became complicated when he pushed for more say. Not because he was being unreasonable, but because he was stepping outside the role they'd built for him. George Michael wasn't supposed to be difficult. He was supposed to be grateful. That was the invisible bargain. They gave him the world, and in return, he was supposed to hand over his freedom without calling it that. And for a while he had, because it didn't feel like surrender at first. It felt like success. But the older he got, the more he realized something. Success can be another form of captivity. The world doesn't just applaud you. It expects you to stay the same forever. And the industry rewards obedience, not humanity, not complexity, not growth. George was learning that the hard way, and Prince was learning it too in his own war. Prince didn't fight quietly. Prince fought like a storm. He turned his own name into a symbol. He made himself unmarketable on purpose. He became a riddle the industry couldn't package. He made the fight visible. So visible it made executives furious. So visible it made other artists nervous. Because when one person breaks the rules, everyone else has to admit the rules exist. And that was the terrifying part. Prince wasn't just rebelling, he was exposing the system. George watched it unfold like someone watching a fire from behind glass. Part of him admired it. Part of him felt sick, because he understood what Prince was risking, and he understood something else too. Prince was strong enough to survive being misunderstood. George wasn't sure he was. George had always been sensitive to the way people saw him, not because he needed approval in a shallow way, but because he carried a deep hunger to be seen correctly, to be known. And the tragedy of fame is that it makes being known almost impossible. People don't want the truth. They want a version, a character, a story that fits inside a headline. And George Michael was already fighting to protect his private self. The self that didn't belong to tabloids. The self that didn't belong to rumors. The self that didn't belong to anyone's expectations. If he fought the industry the way Prince fought, George feared he would lose the last pieces of privacy he still had. Prince could disappear into his mystery. George would be chased, torn open, judged, not just as an artist, as a person. So George tried another path, a quieter rebellion. He started asking for more control over his work. He started resisting the machine in small, strategic ways. But the machine doesn't like strategy. It likes obedience. And the more George resisted, the more he realized something Prince had already learned. The industry doesn't negotiate with your soul. It negotiates with your fear. And George had fear. Not of losing money, not of losing fame, but of losing himself. Because George's identity had always been fragile in public. There were parts of him he had to hide, parts he couldn't explain, parts he wasn't ready to let the world touch. And that meant the industry had leverage over him. Leverage he didn't talk about. Leverage he didn't even want to admit existed. So when the pressure came, it didn't just feel like business. It felt personal. It felt invasive. It felt like being cornered. And this is where the story becomes complicated. Because George wasn't fighting villains with evil laughter. He was fighting people in suits who believed they were doing their jobs. People who could ruin your life with a calm voice. People who could smile while they took something from you. And George started to feel that kind of danger. The danger that doesn't shout. The danger that quietly makes you doubt your own right to exist. That's why Prince's words stayed with him. Own your soul. It sounded poetic, but it wasn't poetry. It was survival. And George began to understand what it meant. Owning your soul meant being willing to lose things. It meant being willing to disappoint people. It meant being willing to walk away. And George didn't know if he could do that yet. Because George still wanted to be loved, still wanted to be understood, still wanted to give the world beauty and not be punished for it. He believed deep down there had to be a way to win without burning down everything around him. Prince didn't believe that. Prince believed you burn it down or it burns you. And the tension between those two beliefs became the tension inside George. A private war, a slow unraveling. The kind of unraveling that doesn't look dramatic until you look back. There were moments George would later describe with careful language. Not rage, not bitterness, just sadness. The sadness of realizing that the people who benefited most from his art didn't truly care about his freedom. They cared about his output, his numbers, his consistency. And George started to withdraw, not from music, from people, from interviews, from explaining himself, because explaining yourself to people who don't want to understand is a kind of humiliation. And George had endured enough humiliation, so he grew quieter, more guarded, more distant. He started holding things back, not just emotionally, creatively. He began protecting parts of his work the way you protect something fragile from hands that don't know how to touch it. And somewhere in the middle of that, he made the decision, not the final decision, not the big public war yet, but the internal decision, the moment where he stopped believing the system would ever let him be free willingly. The moment where he realized he might have to take freedom. And that realization frightened him, because taking freedom means confrontation. And confrontation means exposure. And exposure was the one thing George feared most. So He delayed, he waited, he tried to find a softer way, but the industry doesn't reward softness, it punishes it. And as George delayed, pressure tightened around him. Deadlines, expectations, control. And in the background, like a shadow he couldn't shake, Prince's rebellion kept echoing, a reminder, a warning, a mirror. And George began to suspect something that made his stomach turn. That Prince wasn't just rebelling for himself. He was rebelling for artists like George, too. For artists who couldn't afford to go that far, artists who were still trying to survive inside the machine. Which meant Prince wasn't just an inspiration, he was a challenge. A question George couldn't avoid forever. If Prince could risk everything to stay free, what was George willing to risk? And when George finally stepped toward his own war, it wouldn't begin with shouting. It would begin with silence. A cold, deliberate silence. The kind that makes the people in power nervous. Because silence is the first sign an artist has stopped asking for permission. When George finally moved, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was almost surgical. He stopped playing the part they wanted. He stopped smiling on command. He stopped acting like the contract was a blessing. And when the industry tried to tighten its grip, George did something that terrified them. He made it public, not in a chaotic way, in a controlled way, the kind of control he had been practicing in silence for years. The lawsuit wasn't just paperwork, it was a confession. Declaration that the thing Prince had warned him about was real, that an artist could be successful, adored, and still not belong to himself. And the world watched it like entertainment. But for George, it wasn't entertainment, it was grief. Because what he was really grieving wasn't just ownership of songs, it was the loss of innocence. The moment he realized the industry didn't love him back, not the way he loved music, not the way he loved the audience, not the way he loved the idea of being free. Years later, George would speak about it with careful restraint, not with rage, not with vengeance, just with a kind of tired clarity, as if the fight had aged him in places no one could see. And then, quietly, the truth revealed itself. The thing that Prince understood from the beginning. The thing George didn't want to accept. Freedom wasn't something the industry could grant. Freedom was something you had to take. And taking it meant paying for it. With time, with peace, with the version of yourself that still believed the world was fair. That's why the conversation stayed with him. Not because Prince had insulted him, not because there was rivalry, but because Prince had named the price out loud. Owning your soul meant losing the comfort of being owned. And George Michael, who had always wanted to be understood, held gently, loved without conditions, realized too late that the industry only loves what it can control. In the end, he fought, not perfectly, not without scars, but he fought. And maybe that was the pact between them, not spoken publicly, not written anywhere, just two artists in two different storms, trying in their own ways to make sure their music didn't outlive their freedom.